So, at long last, it seems like the stars are aligning. We can finally close the book on the Churchill Downs and Bob Baffert beef that stemmed from the 2021 positive for Medina Spirit in the Kentucky Derby. John, both parties released statements over the weekend. Very lawyer-friendly statements, I would say. Why don't you tell the people what Bob Baffert and Churchill Downs both said?
Well, and basically, I'll read them verbatim, and then we can kind of pick them apart, Joe. But I agree. I think it was a situation where the attorneys got involved and basically said, here's what we want you to say. No, come back, be softer on this. This is what we want you to, this is what we're willing to say. No, we want to. And basically, they kind of came to a meeting of the minds because simultaneously, both statements were sent out. And also, I think the next day, the lawsuit that Zidane Racing Stables was involved with was this. He immediately pulled it. So I think that was a very coordinated effort on all the parties that be to basically say we're closing this chapter on this situation, and basically, you can, if you admit to a little bit, we'll yield a little bit, and we'll all kind of meet in the middle. And 3+ years later, they finally have come to an agreement. So, Joe, let me read first what came from the Baffert camp that is actually pinned to his Twitter feed as we speak. This is from Bob Baffert. I accept responsibility for Medina Spirit's positive test in the 2021 Kentucky Derby. I am responsible for any substance found in the horses that I train, and I've paid a very steep price with a 3-year suspension and the disqualification of Medina Spirit's performance. I understand and appreciate that Churchill Downs and the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission took steps to enforce the rules that they believed were necessary to protect the safety and integrity of horse racing and the reputation of the Kentucky Derby. My family and I want to put this behind us and get back to doing what we love to do without any more distraction or negativity. I very much look forward to returning to Churchill Downs and getting back to the winner's circle. Now, I would have to say, Joe, is it okay if I just continue to kind of mine it? Okay.
Keep rolling.
So with regard to the statement, again, it was very measured. It was very, lawyerese and basically saying that, whereas Baffert said, I take responsibility for Medina Spirit's positive test. He is not saying I did something that basically made the horse test positive. He's just saying I take responsibility for the positive test. Okay, so that's number one. And he's also saying that, I am responsible for any substance found in the horses that I train, which I'm sure Churchill Downs said you have to say, because in accordance with, the rules and regulations, you are the responsible party. Anything that goes on in your camp, in your barn, ultimately falls at your feet. So I think that was a very important statement that was mandated, I'm guessing, but was mandated to be in the statement. And I love the fact that he then said, I understand and appreciate Churchill Downs and the commission took steps to enforce rules that they believe were necessary. So basically saying, even if I did something and ultimately I'm the responsible person, it's your rules that I don't necessarily, agree with in this case. And then the nice sentiment, my family and I want to just put this forward without having to basically saying like, hey, can we all just ignore what I've done in the past and just kind of move forward and look forward accordingly. So do I think that he's accepting responsibility? Absolutely. Do I think that he's being, again, not getting into his head? Do I feel like that Bob Baffert is basically being contrite in saying I'm coming hat in hand and I made these mistakes? No, I think that basically they basically made him say what he needed to say, and he was willing to admit without additional guilt or association with what happened with Medina Spirit. He still is not saying anything about why the horse died or who's responsible for that. But we'll never get to the bottom of that. I guess basically this is finally, after 3 years, this is what all the parties that are involved are willing to accept and willing to admit. And now we can kind of turn the page and move forward. And again, just ignore what happened, previously.
So let's read the Churchill statement. It says this is from Bill Carstangen, and Churchill Downs has lifted his suspension, so Baffert is eligible to return at the 2025 Kentucky Derby. He says, "We're satisfied that Mr. Baffert has taken responsibility for his actions, completed a substantial penalty, is committed to running in full compliance with the rules and regulations going forward. All parties agree that it's time to bring this chapter to a close and focus on the future. Mr. Baffert is welcome to return at any of CDI's racetracks, including our flagship Churchill Downs racetrack, and we wish him and his connections good luck in their future competitive endeavors." I don't want to spend too much time on this because everything that could possibly conceivably be said about Bob Baffert and Churchill Downs has already been said, probably by us at some point. but it just, to me, my takeaway is it just proves once and for all how petty and short-sighted Bob was being from the jump, and then how petty Churchill Downs was being a little bit further down the line. Like,
I'm glad you get both, Joe, because I think they both were getting petty. Yeah.
No, for sure. But it started like if Bob had just done this 3 years ago, he didn't even have to get up there and say anything. He just put out a lawyer-approved statement, taking quasi-responsibility. As soon as the positive was confirmed, like none of this would have happened, I don't think.
Right.
We could have avoided 3 years of ugliness, pettiness, controversy, and a lot of stories that were about the Kentucky Derby that led with why a certain trainer wasn't there, and not about the horses and the trainers and the horsemen who were there. And so I do agree with Bob in one aspect. Like, it is time to close this chapter, to let Bob run his horses at Churchill and move forward with the Derby in a spirit of unity and celebration, which is what the Derby should be about. It's just it's a shame that it took 3 years for everyone to put on their big boy pants and make nice. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, and Joe, I think it took 3 years because it took that long for everything to play out in the court system, quite frankly. It was like one team was fighting it, the other team had to countersue, a third party came in and countersued that suit. And basically, once everything was exhausted from a legal standpoint, then I think the parties said, okay, well, now we can get together. Now that basically I'm going to have to accept some of this responsibility. And both parties had to say that. Both parties, we talked about how, we felt that Churchill Downs was enough. Like after a couple of years, they basically set the goalposts and said, you have a 2-year suspension, and then move the goalposts once that 2 years, was up. So it was definitely starting to get into a serious pissing match. And less with the facts of the matter, and more like, well, you hurt my feelings, well, you embarrassed me, so now we're going to continue to have this feud. So I'm glad that I won't even say the cooler heads prevailed. Basically, it had to go through this exhaustive legal process before they could even get to the table and get this down. Now, if you remember when we interviewed Mike Tirico, one of the things that we talked about in that interview was the fact that NBC Sports really didn't mention Baffert during this year's Derby, and what a breath of fresh air it was about the fact that they didn't have to mention who wasn't there. They pretty much only focused on the horses who did show up and the parties that did show up. And I think even Mike said, I don't want to paraphrase for him, but I think his sentiment was like, yeah, it was nice. It was a nice breath of fresh air that we got to talk about what the stories were, not what the stories could have been.
No, totally. And it's again, it just feels like a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted acrimony. And I'm glad that we're going to be able to turn the page and move forward and just, have the Derby be about the horses and about the pageantry and the spectacle that it is, because it was a drag having to I did some TV spots go on, and the first question I got asked is about Bob Baffert.
Right.
And I'm sure I was not alone on that. And everyone just kind of wanted to focus on the horses.
Usually the first question that I get on shows is, what's Joe Bianca really like? That's the one. Exactly. So you have,
do you really know? Do you really know Joe?
Yeah, exactly. Is that pillowcase you're selling on eBay really? Did he really sleep on that? It's amazing. The questions I get about the budding star that I have in my partner Joe Bianca.
Yeah. No, for sure.
You got free margaritas at on Haskell Day, for God's sake. I don't know. I don't know how many other people did that.
Yeah, no, they want me to come back. That's definitely obvious in the way I was treated down at Monmouth Park.